Good morning again. As we've said many times over these last couple days, it's great to be back together at the GA. It's an opportunity for all of us to come together, meet informally, meet old acquaintances, but also to attend these formal sessions, to learn from one another, and to hopefully address the most important issues that affect all of us as we go back to our communities. For those that don't know me, my name is Richard Sandler. Over the past 15 years, I've had the privilege of chairing the Los Angeles Federation and also Jewish federations in North America. This experience has given me many opportunities to do a lot of listening and a lot of thinking about our Jewish life and what helps it flourish. I truly believe that Jewish communities flourish in stable democracies. Democracies that are based upon a free and very respectful exchange of ideas and trust in the institutions of government and trust in one another. In the United States, as we heard yesterday from Ambassador Gutman as she commented, we tend to take for granted the stability of our democratic institutions. But today, what we see is a lack of trust, a lack of respect for different groups with different points of view, a proliferation of information on social media and traditional media that is false and often very inflammatory. Political and cultural forces have created cleavages that threaten America's fundamental compact and trust in our democratic institutions and the security of our communities. This divisiveness, distrust, and disrespect we see in Washington, we see it in the media, and we see it in society in general. And as Rabbi Yitz Greenberg told us yesterday and Eric Goldstein told us this morning, we see it in our own communities. We know to have a stable democracy, we have to be educated about the issues. And to do that, we have to engage in respectful debate. We have to start listening to each other and experience government institutions that not only provide fundamental services, but treat us all fairly, protect us, and create an environment where all of us can work together and rebuild trust in that American compact. So I am looking forward to our discussion this morning, which brings together very thoughtful leaders with diverse vantage points, but who all care about democracy and about respectful debate and trust. Sitting next to Alani here is my good friend Ted Deutsch. Ted, as many of you know, was an outstanding longtime congressman from the state of Florida. He is an alum of the National Young Leadership Cabinet, which is his most important thing on his resume. And he has now taken on the responsibility as the CEO of the American Jewish Committee, for which we should all be very grateful. Thank you, Ted. Next to Ted is Shelley Greenspan. Shelley has the simple, easy job today of being the Jewish liaison in the President Biden's White House. Shelley knows these issues very, very well from her many years working at AIPAC and for her interest in this area of the intersection of politics and Jewish life. And to the far right, because Darius has never been accused before of being at the far right, so I just wanted to get his thing, is Darius Jones. Darius is the founder and president of the National Black Empowerment Council, whose mission is to close the wealth, influence, and achievement gap between the African American community and those more strategically advantaged groups. He is the founder, as I said that, he also spent many years working at AIPAC, was a colleague of Shelley's at AIPAC, as he headed up AIPAC's efforts to have interaction with the African American community. And last and certainly not least is our own very talented Alana Brotman, Senior Vice President of Public Affairs at Jewish Federations in North America, and no stranger herself to politics and Jewish communal life. So Alana, I turn it over to you, and I'm sure we will be very interested in what everyone has to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello? Yes, it is. Wake up. Richard, thank you. Thank you for your long service in our community and how much you've continued to lend a hand in and guide our thinking. So we're going to start with the questions right away because we've got so much to uncover here. When we think of democracy, here in the US or in other countries, we so often focus on elections, especially when in our country we're a week away, in Israel we're a day away. But we know that a true democracy requires investments 365 days a year. It's the building blocks, our institutions that work, people that trust them, and adherence to political pluralism that fosters citizens' ability to have a voice in governance. Each of you come with such a rich background, both in government and in grassroots. I'd love to have each of you take a quick take to get us started. What's your take on what's working in America's democratic institution building and what's not? Ted. Easy question to start with.
Thanks. I'll offer a quick take. First of all, thanks for having me. It's really great to be on a panel with all three of you. And look, if we're to get things started, there are a lot of things that aren't working. I think we just have to be candid about that. As we think about functioning democracy, there has to be some respect for institutions. That's been a huge challenge. There has to be an ability to interact with one another. That's come under great challenge. And what it requires, what a really well-functioning democracy requires, is an ability to actually come together to work for the betterment of our nation, despite having different views along the way. And right now, at a time when the last New York Times recently had a poll, I think about 3/4, almost 75% of likely voters think that our democracy is under attack. We have to work to build trust. We can't, all of us here cannot build trust in our institutions, but we can build trust with one another that helps to provide the institutional support that we need. That's what Shelley's doing in the White House. It's what Darius does. It's what AJC and what I'm trying to do at AJC does. It's looking to build with one another a respect for people that pushes the polarization, the vitriolic hatred to the margins where it belongs, and that works to occupy the firm center left, center right that believes in institutions and democracy and free and fair elections and institutions that work.
Wow, that's a great start for us in talking about institutions, Shelley.
Yeah,
obviously.
I mean, I think, to be honest, we are a big, diverse, complicated country, and democracy is sometimes really messy, and the only way to really ensure that it endures for generations is to make sure that we respect the guardrails of the institution, exactly like what you were saying. And it's on all of us. It's not just up to the federal government, but protecting and preserving the democracy is something that we need to do every single day. I know it's something that the Biden-Harris administration is fiercely committed to, and we need to make sure that we're all doing our part, not just at the federal government level, but at organizations like AJC, like the Federation, that we're passing along these values to our children. In terms of what's working, I think it's actually really going back to education and investing in civic education. I know President Biden recently I think issued an order to Congress to increase funding for civic education, but really affording every single American the opportunity to learn about our nation's history, the good, the bad, the really not so good, to make sure they then understand the founding principles of our country, which will then enable them to develop the skill sets to become civically engaged members of society. So it really, for me at least, all stems back to education.
Thank you. And I think when we talk about institutions and this whole question, Darius, you have been building grassroots institutions. And so the same question from your angle.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. So just very quickly, just to add a little bit more information about National Black Empowerment Council, which I think can kind of provide some context as to why I'm here. Again, as you heard, it's a national network, African-American leaders, grass tops folks, business, politics, academia, health, tech, work together in a very meaningful way for the uplift of African Americans in the area of social justice, economic empowerment, and education. What makes us unique amongst all current African American organizations, I'm particularly proud of it, is that everyone who's a member of my organization traveled with me or my colleagues to Israel when I was at APAC. So imagine a national network of grassroots black leaders in positions of real influence who all have a keen understanding of the importance of the U.S.-Israel relationship and who are really leaning in as it relates to black-Jewish relations. And I think that kind of dynamic is going to be critical in addressing a lot of the concerns that we're going to talk about today. What's working? In terms of voter participation, I just voted in Georgia before I came up here. Absolutely. Absolutely record turnouts. When I showed up to vote, I was in and out in 10 minutes, so the nuts and bolts are fine. There was security there. There was a diverse array of poll workers. So it felt like, you know, an environment that's really conducive to electoral participation. What's not working? I feel like America's not really upholding a lot of its core democratic values. Our nation is 246 years old. So amongst the family of nations, we're an adolescent, okay? And like an adolescent, I feel like we're at an inflection point. We can either accept the values that were taught to us by our parents, thinking democracy, or in our rebelliousness, we can try to go a different path. And when I think about democratic values, I think about diversity, I think about inclusion, I think about equality. But I also think about, in our system, the exercise of self-restraint when you're in power. That's critical in our democracy, to not really put the foot on the throttle and exercise all the power that you have at your disposal when you're in the majority. The flip side of that is also when you're not in the majority, that you fundamentally accept the will of the people and abide by what's best for the nation. When I think about January 6th, I think about kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs comes to mind. Those last two ideas about exercising restraint and accepting the will of the people, that's all well and good until you feel like you are locked in an existential struggle. And I feel like the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th have been misled into a fundamental belief that people like me and people like you are hell-bent on their destruction. And based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you don't have the luxury of being able to ascribe to higher, loftier values when you feel like your existence is threatened. And what I recognize in that is that there are some very sophisticated, very intelligent, very well-funded bad actors who are fomenting that belief. And in the guise of that belief are instituting anti-democratic reforms. And they're crowd surfing that sentiment to a level of power that we've never seen before in this country. And if we cannot pull together civil society, if we cannot constitute an axis that's going to be in opposition to what they're trying to do, this could all get away from us.
Can I respond? Do you mind, Darius? Because that was great, and you're such a good ally. And I just want to cut. I would like. This is a group I am very familiar with. I am a proud alum of, as you heard, of Young Leadership Cabinet. These are issues we've been dealing with for a long time. But Darius makes a good point and is a really important ally. And just to cut to the chase, we can talk about the challenges writ large, the institutional challenges. But we see those challenges play out in attacks against our community, the rise in anti-Semitism. We see it play out in attacks against people of color. We see it play out in attacks against immigrants. And as someone who was sitting in a dark cubicle on January 6th, listening to people run by my office and thinking to myself, knowing that they were wearing they were burnishing their hatred literally on their sleeves, and thinking that I was so fortunate because it was a new office and I hadn't yet had an opportunity to put the mezuzah on the door, so maybe that would allow them to keep running past my office. It is clear that sorry to jump right in, but if we are not, if we are not standing up both for ourselves and condemning anti-Semitism wherever it comes from, and working as closely as we can with our allies like Darius, who understand that attacks on the Jewish community are not just limited to the Jewish community. They represent a threat to our democracy as a whole. They are attacks by people who spend just as much time worrying about how they're going to take on other communities, minority communities. We're in this together, and I just didn't want to miss the opportunity, given how powerful Darius's comments were, to say thank you for being in this battle with us to make our community and our country stronger.
So I'd like to actually pivot from that and go to a question to both Darius and Shelley. I mean, Darius, you're building the grassroots. Your headquarters is in Atlanta, but I know I've seen your work in Dallas, I've seen your work in DC, and I'd love for you to describe a little bit to the audience, because what you're saying is, Ted, I think, is this is the threat to democracy, but I think the antidote, to get to the antidote, is that community relations that we're building. And then Shelley, from your perch, because you see this not just as the Jewish liaison, I believe, but you see all the work that's done with, in partnership with faith communities. And that's not a partisan, it's not any one White House. This has been done by both parties. And so I'd love to, the view from, I love how you talk about it, Darius, not the grassroots, but the grass tops, and the view from the biggest institution in our land.
You wanna go ahead, Sean?
Sure. When I first started this job about 3 months ago, I was speaking to a group of students, and the first question I got was, how do you plan to adequately represent all the opinions of the Jewish community? And I was like, oh my God. That is not my job. I don't wish that job upon anybody. I really serve as
That's the
this
Jewish
bridge.
Federations.
Oh,
Thank you very much.
Thank you for all the work that you guys are doing. Jokes aside, I mean, the biggest privilege of this job is getting to see American Jews live up to their values every single day in a very tangible way. President Biden often uses this quote from the Talmud, actually. It is not required that you complete the work, but nor may you refrain from work. And let me tell you, the Jews do not refrain from the work. I have a very packed schedule, and it's just because these issues matter so much to the Jewish community. Whether it's local philanthropies, the Federation, social justice organizations, the increased voter turnout within our Jewish community, these issues really matter to the Jewish community, and it's important that we work with others. Right now, I sit in the Office of Public Engagement. I have one desk, but everyone around me is focused on a different community, and the reason why I'm sitting there, like physically, because I also have I'm dual-hatted, so I have another desk on the 3rd floor, but I try to spend most of my time on the 1st floor, is because I want to make sure that we're collaborating with the other community liaisons. So it's not just, hey, can you come to this summit on anti-Semitism, but hey, how can we better support your communities? And I was actually thinking about this yesterday because I was sitting front row for Ambassador Lipstat's speech. I don't know if anyone was in the audience for it, but it was incredible. I'm trying to get a copy of it myself. And towards the end, she was talking about how, when she wakes up every morning, she says the Modeh Ani, thank you, God, for giving me another day to do this incredible work. And I know there's a series of prayers that we say afterwards. One of them is like, thank you for not making me a woman. I don't know about that one, but one of them is, thank you for making me a Jew. Although I think it also says thank you for not making me a Gentile. But regardless, so in preparing for this panel, I woke up this morning, and it's not just thank you for making me a Jew, thank you for making me an American Jew, and we have this responsibility, I think, to uphold these values. Our histories are so interwoven, and just part of the work we do, and I get to see it every day in the work that the Federation does, in the work that your organizations do in such a tangible way. Not every community has a liaison at the White House, but I think because we are so passionate about public service, it warrants a role, I think, since the Carter administration. So thank you for all the work that you guys are doing.
Absolutely, absolutely. To that, kind of piggyback on Shelley's remarks. And then also kind of in the earlier iteration of the questions that you shared with us that I kind of prepared for. The question was, should the Jewish community...
I've never seen Darius not riff on a question, so
fine.
I'm not worried.
The earlier iteration of the question was, should the Jewish community make the preservation of democracy a centerpiece of its communal work? And that's kind of a no-brainer, because it's like, to me, if we ask ourselves, would racism be better or worse in the absence of a strong democracy? Would anti-Semitism be better or worse in the absence of a strong democracy? And what I would say to my brothers and sisters in the Jewish community is to not only make it a centerpiece of your communal work, but within the human family, to really lead on the issue. For 10 years, I worked at AIPAC, and for 4 years prior to that, I was an activist. And in that milieu, I saw the Jewish community sincerely reaching out to people from other communities for the purposes of building strong relationships that would work for the betterment of your community and would work for the betterment of our community as well. You have expertise in that space. You have a strong sense of commitment to social justice and a strong inclination to want to see people be the best that we can possibly be. Lean into that traditional role that you've played. There are folks in the African American community and the Hispanic community who see the world the way you see the world, who recognize the threats that you recognize, and who want to be a part of a communal effort to help take things to the next level. I know a lot of times you've tried to reach out and engage with other communities, and maybe you didn't necessarily have the best partner on the other end, and therefore you weren't able to make everything as effective as it could possibly be. But there are folks from my community and other communities who are working together to really pull together the best and brightest folks of our community and bring them to the table to join you in partnership in this effort. Because if we don't do it, it's not going to get done. And if there's anyone throughout history who knows more about man's capability of his inhumanity to his fellow man, it's blacks and Jews. And because of that, we have an inherent responsibility within the human family to speak up when we see injustice. So I encourage you, assume a position of leadership and know that like-minded people will join you in that effort.
That's beautiful. Beautiful, really, thank you. And yeah, you could totally clap. That's totally clappable. I want to zoom out for a second because we've been thinking a little bit, I think, in the context of the United States, and think about the Jewish community and democracy and why democracy. The past 6 months, we as Americans and we as the Jewish community and the Federation community have been working a lot to help Ukrainians leave the war zone. And there are a number of them who wanted to come here, right? And part of it is democracy, part of it is family relationships, et cetera. My family came here in the mid-'70s, and I remember actually my parents, I was learning English, and my parents made me look up every single word of the Pledge of Allegiance so that I would know exactly why we came here. And I think a lot of people feel that way. But when you zoom out, for the Jewish community, we've certainly lived in democracies that didn't turn out so well. I mean, let's remember Germany in the 30s, but even Argentina, even Iran has an election. And so I wanted to turn to Ted because of all your work in Congress around foreign policy and also the perch you now have, which is sort of, I always think of the Jewish diplomatic corps. That was a big slip, diplomatic corps.
Democratic, small d democratic corps. Yeah.
But just zooming out and being a little ecumenical around, is democracy good for us? Why should we invest in this? Just kind of philosophically.
Well, the answer is unequivocally yes. I mean, it is. But let's be clear: having an election doesn't mean you're a democracy. You're right. There are elections. There are elections in Russia. You mentioned Iran. There was an election in Iran. But when the supreme leader decides who's able to run, then you wind up with an so-called elected leader who has blood on his hands, literally going back decades in his own country. So there's democracy that actually functions well, and those are democracies in which the Jewish community has always flourished. If we don't have the ability to participate in a fully functioning democracy, and again, we've seen this throughout history, and Darius just made this point too. If we're not in a fully functioning democracy, the risks to our community increase, and they increase dramatically. We need to, look, AJC's mission is to enhance the well-being of the Jewish people in Israel and advance human rights and democracy, because we know what happens when democracy starts to get chipped away at. And that's that's in large part what we've seen growing in this country and around the world. We've seen it on social media. The fact that we're doing a panel on democracy and we've made it this far without talking about social media is astounding to me. But let me just acknowledge what we all know to be the case. We have now the ability for people to reach millions of others, millions of their followers. By the way, a word I hate because it's not, we don't follow. For all the people who subscribe to Kanye's outrageously anti-Semitic rants, I'm not going to call all of them his followers, but I will point out that he has the ability to spread this hatred, and the digitization of hatred really undermines our democracy. So yes, we have an obligation to speak up, to advocate for strong democracy, and we need to do it because of the opportunities that it gives the Jewish community to participate. Let's all acknowledge the fact that Shelley is sitting in the White House, interacting with different representatives of other groups, and the President and Vice President of the United States is incredible. And for those of us who have had the opportunity to see Ken Burns' documentary about the Holocaust, it's a pretty good reminder of how important it is for us to continue to be engaged and to fight to ensure that there is always a place at a table, but that place at the table is in a democracy that welcomes all viewpoints. And that requires a battle, and in Congress we focused on countries around the world where democracy was constantly at risk. We need to do the same thing in our own country when the challenges of extreme partisanship and political violence, something I think we also have to acknowledge is real and dangerous, is front and center in all of our minds and in this discussion that we're having here this morning.
Looked like you were trying to say something, Shelley.
No, I was nodding in agreement. I think even the fact that we're having this panel here at a 3-day General Assembly summit is evidence to how important this topic is to our country. I don't know if this is a first or if you guys have had this panel on previous so maybe it's a first. So I'm all about firsts, and I think this is an incredible first and something to be celebrated, that we're taking time out of the day to discuss the importance of democracy to the Jewish community. President Biden often says that the sacredness of democracy is really up to this generation, and there's a role for every American to play in that, and there really isn't a role for every single American Jew. When he says American, he means also every single American Jew to play in that. So it's not just us three sitting up here talking about our personal perspectives and where we see it, but we're looking directly at you, but really we're looking at your communities back home and ways we can partner with you to uplift the work that you guys are doing. So I just want to continue encouraging that because you guys are on the ground. So thank you.
My mic, I'm just going to yell really loudly so that I don't keep fussing with my mic. Because media was brought up, and I think about, okay, thank you. Thanks. Media is what? Is it the fourth domain? I mean,
Fourth estate.
Fourth estate. Thank you. It is a key point to democracy, right? It's not just voting; it's how we talk to each other. And we live in an era of the last 30 years or so where everybody has a huge microphone, and ideas proliferate, and that could be to the good, of course, but we know that there have been some really deep, dark, toxic conversations, or it's like yelling out there when in the forest, except this time the forest all hears you. But the response to that is probably not just in the media. It's not just yelling back online, but it's all that kind of communal work that you all are doing. And I'd love to also go around and maybe starting with Darius on that as well.
Well, I mean, I'm going to say something. I think most of you here probably join me in this sentiment. I'm extremely disappointed in the media, in particular what masquerades as news. I remember being a young child and coming from a very civically engaged household, watching Walter Cronkite, Peter Jennings, Tom Brokaw, with my parents. And they would kind of just shoot straight down the middle, give you the facts, and allow you as an intelligent, responsible American to come to whatever conclusion that you came to about what had just been presented to you. I feel like we're 25 years removed from that. Now it's just a constant barrage, a constant bombardment of people's perspectives, which are designed, in my eyes, to divide us. I mean, I feel like when Donald Trump was president, he sucked up all the oxygen. He was actually great for the media. I mean, I watched the news every day like it was a TV show, because I was like, what'd he do today? You know, it was constant content. And I feel like in the absence of that whenever there are things that happen in our society that are potentially divisive, that are toxic, they're amplified for the purposes of recapturing that dynamic. And it's like it's driving wedges between our folks. And I know one of the things I say in my group and in my organization, and they give me a hard time about it, but I'm like, stop deifying celebrities. Like, just because you're a talented artist doesn't mean you need to tell me how to think politically. And it's like, I can see how sometimes people are used to have these large platforms for the purposes of fomenting chaos, discord, and division. And I just really struggle to try to figure out what can be done to try to thwart some of all that I see, these very clear and present agendas that exist in the media. I mean, folks that I know are disengaging from it. They're kind of turning away and finding alternative news sources which are as unbiased as they could possibly be. But I just fret for the future of our democracy when I see what's continuously being done. And sometimes I wonder if I live in a world where people outside of this room don't see the dynamics as clearly as we see them.
I can so relate. Growing up, my grandparents, they were Holocaust survivors, and I remember going to their apartment in Aventura every day after school, and they'd be glued to the news. And that would oftentimes inspire their own civic engagement, bringing me to the polls with them. But I think that if they were alive today and I'd be going to their apartment and I would see them watching the news like with such tenacity, I'd be worried almost for their own mental health, which is so terrible to have to say. I think for a functioning democracy to survive, people need to have reliable access to trusted news sources. And I think one of the reasons I was actually so upset when Ted announced his retirement is that really, a lot of it is on Congress to hold these tech platforms accountable. I know the president has called on Congress to really put some more effort behind their regulation with tech companies. We need to understand what these algorithms can do, because oftentimes these algorithms are spewing hate speech, they're causing misinformation, and really, turning to hate-fueled violence. And without that transparency, we almost have no control over it.
Absolutely.
So, I completely understand how, you go from viewing the news with such regard in a young age, and then growing up, you start to think otherwise. But it's a growing problem and an issue that we need to address federally and with Congress as well.
I agree completely, but I want to emphasize that there are opportunities that we now have that we've never had before as well.
True.
I was a member of Congress, and I represented Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. And when that shooter came in and killed 17 people, the kids, the high school kids, organized and said, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. And they used social media, they used their own social media platforms, their very sophisticated understanding of what their peers needed and wanted to hear, and they built a movement. And it was incredible to see sitting at the dining room table with a bunch of high school kids who literally created the largest march that ever took place, with marches in countries all around the world. They did that on their own. They had the tools to do it. We have tools now that we've never had before. And so for young people, AJC trains high school kids to be advocates. and they can advocate not just on college campuses and when they graduate and when they're part of Young Leadership Cabinet and coming to the GA. They can do it right now, and pushing back against the anti-democratic forces and the hate, and building a real culture of empathy, and one that understands the importance of democracy, and one that fights back against the anti-Semites and against the racists and against the far extreme dangerous elements in our society. They have the tools to do it. They're doing it now. And yes, I bemoan the fact that tech companies have algorithms that will gladly send hate-filled bile to your inbox, to your feed, if that's what you sign up for. Not even what you sign up for. It's what you look at. And then it gives you more and more and more. Yes, there's more that needs to be done there. And yes, there is a news outlet for literally every political view, and it's harder to find common ground. But I wanted to just take a moment to acknowledge that for young people especially, right now there is the chance to start to transform that in ways that, frankly, all of us, no matter how old you are, if you're sitting here, all of us in some ways are too old to really appreciate. We have to continue to lift them up, give them the tools that they need to help us change this debate. It's going to be better for their generation. Most importantly, it's going to be better for our country and our world.
I was going to say, and then no, great point. And then another way I feel like the media has contributed to the current state of affairs is just the demonization of government. I mean, is government perfect? I mean, we all know government is not perfect.
What?
But in our, I'm sorry, that was a good one, Shel. But in our society, it serves a very necessary function. But I feel like the constant criticism over the last 20 years from both the right and the left has really kind of undermined confidence in the institution. And when there's very little confidence in the institution, then people start to look for alternatives to said institution, okay? And that's something that concerns me, because in my community, government has really kind of been an ally for the African American community. In lots of instances when nobody else was standing for us, it was the government that, helped provide various services, protection, safety that ultimately made African American life palatable. And I just think about even when I was a kid, and it started like in the 80s, and I used to hear the refrain, government is the problem. If we could just get government out of the way, we would have more freedom. And it's like now when I see what happened on January 6th, I'm like, freedom to do what? If you get government out of the way, what are you really trying to liberate yourself to do? Is it that? So it just raises very important questions.
It's working again. I want to say something about that and then get back to media and young people. When I was thinking about this panel and democracy, and I'm going to try to articulate a really long thought into something a little more pithy, but again, it's not the one day. But what I see in our work in the Jewish Federations, for example, and we work with so many agencies that provide services across the panoply, from young kids to very elderly, all kinds of needs. And we work with those kinds of agencies in other communities. And then our agencies are providing services to all sorts of communities. And I think that is democracy in place. And it's really what Darius made me think of, and what Darius is saying. I think that when people are investing together every single day, they're understanding each other's needs. They're seeing each other as both vulnerable and supportive. And they really understand how the entire society works. Government is just a piece of democracy to me, a critical piece. But it's all the faith institutions, the non-faith, philanthropy, all of which binds us together in a way that we have a commitment to each other. And I think that work that's being done all the time by all kinds of nonprofits as well as government, but certainly the direct service institutions that I see every day in JF&A's work. I think it's a really critical part of democracy. But I do want to go back to the media and the young people point and the hopeful point.
Sorry.
No. I think that was hopeful, and then the other, because I also think that for those of us who weren't necessarily native to what came up with social media, the problems are pretty stark. But I think for the generation of, I know where your kids are, where my kid is, where they intrinsically understand what it is they're facing. I think that there's probably more that we could be doing, but also that we're doing just offline. That as they're learning civics and as they're learning what their country's all about, and any one of us could talk about whether it's Darius and young people who are coming into the grassroots work you're doing, whether it's volunteerism and even young fellows at the White House, what you've seen in your district, at Jewish federations, for example. A lot of people in our midst are not the youngest, but we have a whole cohort of what we call change makers. Young people in their early 20s who are already learning how to become philanthropic leaders. Yay, there you go. So I am kind of hopeful, and I wonder if this is totally off script, nobody prepared for this, but I wonder if, just from all your knowledge of how we're bringing young people, and then having them help us think about how to address toxicity and how to really bind us to this country's compact. I wonder if you could speak to that.
I mean, I'll just say I think about this on a weekly basis, at least for my perch at the White House. When I first started, I'm obviously hearing from every single incredible Jewish organization. They want to meet. I want to hear about their priorities. How can I partner with them? But I wasn't hearing from any students. And the truth is, when it comes to issues like anti-Semitism or healthcare or reproductive rights, they're the ones that are facing these issues on the ground. And it's something that, not that I'm struggling with, but I'm trying to figure out how to do a better job of engaging with students, whether it's making sure they're represented at White House meetings, whether I'm going to college campuses, whether I'm inviting them to tour the White House so they can understand what democracy looks like in practice. I mean, it's something that I constantly am trying to figure out, how can we infuse more student voices. Also because as someone who, when I wasn't a student so long ago, like the reason why I was able to pursue a career in public service without sacrificing my Jewish identity was because of people before me. Really made it possible and like showed me the way, and I'm a product of that. Sorry, you can go.
Go ahead.
Shelley, that's beautiful.
No, it really is so important. So when you were talking about uplifting the voices of the Parkland students, it's also, making sure that students who are going into journalism have, an avenue to pursue local journalism, giving them tax credits to pursue that as a career, because I'm sure they're not feeling too optimistic right now. So really an open-ended call. If you guys have ideas of how we can better work with students, whether it's at the high school level, I'm trying to engage with BBYO, NIFTY, NCSY, USY, like these are the real leaders of our country and the real leaders of tomorrow. I can't bring all of them into the White House for a meeting, but we can come up with some creative ideas to make sure their voices are heard and that the ideas they have can really be turned into concrete action with our support. So that's kind of where my head's at right now.
And then, I think engaging younger people is also necessary to find a select group of folks, I think, who are capable of ascribing to higher values. And here's what I mean by that. It happens a lot in my organization, happens in my community. In my organization, National Black Empowerment Council, we have people who served in the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and who did I skip? It went straight in order. I can't believe I had a blank. It was Bush, it was Obama, then it was, no, not Clinton. Clinton was the other direction. Okay, nonetheless, the last 4 presidential administrations, you guys know I'm just having a senior moment. So the last 4 presidential administrations from both parties, we had individuals in our organization who served in those offices, okay? And the reason why we were able to coexist as an organization is that we knew that regardless of what party they were in, their highest motivation was the ascension and the protection of African American interests and values within the larger context of making America the very best nation that it can possibly be. There are levels to leadership, and you're always going to have to find people who, while they would love to be completely and totally absorbed in the issues of the day, parochial issues of the day, you also have to find a select group of people who you prepare for a higher degree of leadership. And what I mean is the folks who can have the adult in the room conversations. You might be a Republican, I might be a Democrat, you might be LGBT, you might be this. But at the end of the day, we're Americans. and we fundamentally communicate with each other and in back channel in order to keep the wheels from coming off the wagon. Like an illustration, if you think about during the Cold War, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff would always have conversations with his equivalent on the other side. If Khrushchev were to go out into the Duma and just rail and say all types of terrible things about America, the general could call his counterpart in the United States and say, his wife made him sleep on the couch last night. He's having a bad day, okay? I think it's going to be necessary when we talk about the creation of civil society to find people from all our respective communities who are capable of playing the game at that level. And to also be very intentional about identifying the next generation of leaders who we can elevate into that type of thinking. Because if we're not having those back channel conversations and keeping the wheels on the wagon, this could all get away from us.
Let me say again how honored I am to be on the panel with all three of you. I completely agree with that, and it's true. It's true in terms of Jewish leadership, but it's also true and this is the right venue, I think, especially to make I think to make this point. It's true in the Jewish community. What's so often lost in conversations about anti-Semitism is the fact that the Jewish community is so diverse that whether it's racial diversity and ethnicity, where people come from, how they identify, whether they're observant religiously or not observant at all, whether they're culturally Jewish, the fact is that kind of diversity matters in the Jewish community, and if we're going to be able to tackle these big issues, we're going to have to make sure that there is an entry point that everyone in the community feels comfortable walking through. There are only 15 million Jews in the world, which we sometimes lose sight of in all of our battles between one another in our community. We can't afford to let the divisions within the community prevent us from doing this important work. We need to have everyone welcome so that there are more opportunities to create leaders and more opportunities to have those leaders sit at the table with the leaders that you're helping to build up in your community. And it's so important for us to focus on that. And Shelley, the one thing I would add to what you said, and as an aside, as someone who taught, when I started in politics, I talked regularly about my dad, who fought the Nazis in the Battle of the Bulge and earned a Purple Heart and was proud of being an American and proud of being Jewish and wanted us to always remember both. And every time I started talking about him, I cried. I got over it a little bit, but I'm so grateful for how moved you are by this conversation and this work. I would only say, when we talk about young people, our fallback position is to talk about the leaders of tomorrow. And I just can't emphasize enough the importance of recognizing that in so many ways, in so many communities, in the Jewish community especially, those young people are our leaders right now. And we have so much we can learn from them right at this moment. And if we can give them the platform and lift them up, they're going to be more resilient, more knowledgeable, better leaders, and better able to join at this table for these kinds of conversations that will make, again, that will make all of us stronger. This is incredible. I appreciate it.
I mean, all my pre-written questions go out the window because this is such a good conversation. So I thought maybe to change it up a little bit and say, why don't we take a few questions from the floor and then come back to the panel questions? Because I think that I'm so curious what this is moving you to think about and how this might shape our conversation. So I'd invite a few questions. I think that you have to go up to the mic. Maybe we'll just take, let's say 2 questions and then see how it goes. Yeah. Yeah.
You can ask one.
So I understand, and I think all of us in the room agree with fighting for democracy and ensuring democracy. I want to take it down to more of a local Jewish issue. And I have witnessed over the last 10 years a wedge within the American Jewish community, marginalizing each other when we come with different political views, and we're losing sight of what we're there to fight for and to support. And you see it in APAC, ADL, where they're losing supporters because they don't feel safe in the room anymore, or that the people that are now leading within locally even don't share the same political views. And I'm concerned about this because when you divide, we're small, 18 million, but when you divide us and when we allow ourselves to be divided, the left feels that it's the right that's causing anti-Semitism. The right feels it's the left. And they all feel like they are fighting for democracy from their perspective. And I think that somehow we need to make it safe for everyone's views to be in the room.
So maybe the question is, how do we do that? Because that's the point you just raised, right? How do we ensure that we're keeping that compact even within our own community?
I left a month ago what is arguably the single most partisan place in America, and now have the good fortune of running an organization that is fiercely centrist, because I absolutely believe, to your point, that if we allow the extremes to carry the debate, then it becomes really uncomfortable for people to be in the same room. If we recognize that, one, most of us are generally we're generally center right, center left, not on the extremes, number one. And number two, if we're here and you're involved in the Jewish community in any way, then we realize that the challenges from outside, from those who would only be too happy to see us continue to eat our own, are so great that we have an obligation to come together. Once you realize those two things, I think you can create an environment that people are comfortable entering together. But you have to be able to recognize that we are all in this battle together, that if all you're going to do is claim that the anti-Semitism that you're concerned about is on the other side, and you're not worried and you're not focused on combating the anti-Semitism that might be a little closer to home for you and your political views, then it's going to be almost impossible for us to make the kind of progress that we need to make. We've got to continue down that path that acknowledges that anti-Semitism, wherever it comes from, has to be condemned singularly. When we do that, yes, there are a handful of people who will not want to participate, but most people will feel more comfortable being in the same room, in the same gathering, in the same fight together.
Yeah, we feel exactly the same way. And Shelley, it looked like you had a few thoughts about that.
I mean, I was nodding in agreement once again, but I think this is just from my own personal perspective. One way we can do that is also going back to the core of Judaism and studying Torah and kind of understanding what it means in a modern context. I know that's been helpful for me as I've, pursued a career in public service and working with others across the aisle. It's really values of our tradition that I'm trying to infuse into the work that we're doing. So I think sometimes we get really caught up into, the alphabet soup of organizations and the different bills. Like, you can get really caught up into that work and not see people for who they are. But if you're talking about just relationships within the Jewish community, I mean, we're all Jews. We might interpret the Torah differently and have different opinions. But I mean, I think sometimes just, I have a weekly Parsha study, and I learn so much from it. And there's people from all walks of life in my weekly Torah study. And it's a great opportunity for us to really just understand what the text is saying and just learn from one another and how we're interpreting it. So for me personally, that's been really helpful.
And Darius, I don't know if you're
I'm
an
not
honorary
qualified.
member, so
I'm
you
not
know.
qualified.
Next question.
Hi. Darius, I want to start with you, but I want to hear the answers from the entire panel. In the fallout of the comments, I don't think we've gone more than 5 minutes at this conference without mentioning Kanye, but there has been the reaction of artists, musicians from the African American community who are not quite going there, but are sort of nodding in agreement And there tends to be this focus that Jews were marching with Martin Luther King in the 1960s, and we like to fall back on that. But there does feel like today there is a split between the communities, that there's not real dialogue going on there, and there's also a feeling in the black community that they're there for the underdog in the Middle East as well. And so I'm wondering kind of where we sit now in 2022. Are there examples of real engagement, productive conversations happening between the Jewish and the black community? And what's your take on things that can be done to kind of reconnect there? And I'm curious as to what's going on in Washington as well on that front.
Absolutely. So, I mean, Kanye West does not speak for black people. I think most people can look at Kanye West and clearly tell that he is wrestling with some mental health challenges. So I would just strongly encourage everyone with the sound of my voice to, just because Kanye West speaks in the way that he speaks, please do not ascribe that sentimentality to other African Americans, because we don't feel that way. What I will say is that when I think about, because again, I was at AIPAC for a long, long time, and I had a lot of meaningful interaction with the Jewish community. I think between our two communities, there's not a lot of meaningful interaction. So in that vacuum, tropes about either community can exist. When Kanye West came out with his comments, I try not to go on Facebook all the time about things of this nature, but I was compelled to speak out on this one because I was saying, you know what, I've been working with the Jewish community 15 years. I've been immersed in the life, the work, the culture, and the causes. And in my recollections, nothing has happened to me which even remotely resembles what Kanye West is talking about. You know, I feel, because of my experience, I've been to Israel 21 times. So I feel, you know, singularly qualified to speak out and to let people in my community who haven't had the level of interaction that I have had with the Jewish community know that those tropes are absurd and that they're ridiculous. And I think the same is true if you watch the 6 o'clock news and you see how we're depicted, or if you watch rap videos and you see how we're depicted. You could get grossly inaccurate perceptions of who we are as a people. So I think that it's going to be incumbent upon us going forward. At the grassroots, I don't know that that's the best place to start. I think that you start amongst people within a particular community who have similar levels of education, who have similar professional levels of professional accomplishment, but who both also have unimpeachable credibility in their own communities. So that way, when we come together and we talk and we reach consensus, when I go back to my community and talk to them about my lived experiences with the Jewish community, because of my unimpeachable credibility on black issues, they're going to listen to me, okay? And if you've been very involved in communal Jewish life and you go back in your circles and within your spheres of influence and speak credibly about, you know, meaningful interactions that you've had with black people, I think that that's going to go a long way to dispel a lot of those stereotypes. But I mean, there's meaningful interaction going on all the time. I mean, I think about, again, the organization that I've built. I think in the existence of National Black Empowerment Council, there is a very unique opportunity to kind of take the black-Jewish relationship to levels that it's never gone before because of, you know, that level of experience that we've had and that level of understanding that we bring to the table. And I think that just like we're making it happen in conjunction with the partnership that we're developing with the Federation out of New York, I think the possibility for those kinds of engagements exist all around the country.
I mean, Darius really is the expert when it comes to the question you asked. I will just say, you know, right before this panel started, we were catching up. We used to be colleagues. And in learning more about the work he was doing, I was thinking, okay, how can we partner together? You know, whether it's an MLK Shabbat in January, what are ways we can work together? How can we uplift the work that you're doing? So that's simply just by having a conversation. We happen to be sitting here right before the panel started. So oftentimes it's just asking someone across, you know, sitting next to you, hey, how can I help the work you're doing? What are ways we can partner? So that's just a small example. I will also say the head of the Office of Public Engagement is Mayor Bottoms from Atlanta, who Darius knows pretty well.
She went on my Israel trip.
She went on his Israel trip. So I mean, there's so many allies that people don't often assume that are, you know, allies for your own community and vice versa. So we make sure to uplift their voices as well.
I would just add, there are really meaningful things happening in the communities around the country. I know I'm going to be in Atlanta in a few days, where AJC is a longstanding Black-Jewish program that's been really impactful. We just last summer took a group of officials from HBCUs to Israel, who are now, the result of which is that they're now engaged in an ongoing process reviewing proposals on some innovation ideas coming out of Israel and coming from HBCUs. That kind of interaction is really important. And the Congressional Black Jewish Caucus, which we launched before COVID, during the Congressional Black Jewish Caucus, is a really good way to not just bring together members of Congress, but to model the kind of interactions that can then happen at state governments and local governments. And those are just some of the things AJC does. JFNA, Federation, local federations, Federation JCRCs, there are lots of programs that are happening right now. We need to double down on those efforts, building those relationships, creating deeper relationships, finding allies to work with, benefit both communities. And we can't wait until we need help in our community, and we can't wait until Israel is under attack. We have to be engaged in the ongoing work of really getting to know one another, finding common cause and things that we can work on together. And it is happening around the country. I'm proud of what AJC is doing. I know that federations and others are doing the same. I'd encourage everyone to look for opportunities to be involved in those kinds of efforts.
And I know there's a question, but I just want to follow up quickly and then come back to the question, which is, let's do a quick round of some prescriptions for exactly that, because you're right, at the federations, we have 146 and we have 250 professionals around the country who then lead lay leadership, but the investment that they're making is stems from the hyper-local to the national and even the multinational, and getting those relationships right, both sort of inter-community relationships right at all those levels, but also then really investing in our voice in government, right? To your point, we're what, 2.5% of the American either voting public or public, so we got to yell pretty loudly, and there are a couple of mechanisms of doing that, and again, knowing the federation system, we do that, right? Professionals, delegations of lay people who, whether they fly on a dime to Washington because they need to advocate for something really critical, or they're investing that in their state governments or in their city governments. They're doing that with other communities. We're working together on anti-poverty programs, or on ensuring that we understand how to secure our institutions, synagogues, churches, mosques, what have you. But I'm just wondering if we can go around again for a few prescriptions on this topic that was raised. What have you seen, even while in Congress, in what sort of worked, and maybe go around? And I think, Shelley, you've had a long political career as well, before the White House. What have you seen work, and so on? So.
Sure. I think regardless of your Jewish background or where you're from, Jewish tradition really supports this notion of civic engagement. I think there's nothing more Jewish than voting and expressing your opinion. That being said, in terms of like what is bringing people to the polls, and what causes people to get involved in civic education, I mean, oftentimes, obviously, Israel is a big issue within the community, and I think it's more so a threshold test to make sure candidates are meeting that threshold. But besides that, I mean, it's education, immigration, healthcare. I recently was speaking to UJA in New York, and I asked them right before, hey, what are some of the topics that you think your members would be interested in hearing from? And let me tell you, it was a megillah of every single issue imaginable. Afghanistan relocation, COVID, healthcare, reproductive rights. And I was like, the truth is I'm just not an expert on every single one of these issues. It's a little bit intimidating, but the truth is, I mean, it was so impressive that the community was so interested in these issues. So I don't think there's like a single issue that the Jewish community cares about as a whole, and I think that's also our biggest strength as well. It's actually fairly easy, in my perspective, to plug in American Jewish stakeholders and organizations into the work across the White House because we are so involved in these issues, not just in, when it comes to anti-Semitism or the U.S.-Israel relationship. Like we really are, you guys really are involved on the grassroots level, so it makes my job a lot easier. But yeah, I mean, in terms of what is driving people to the polls, I think it really is just a number of issues and just feeling that the need to fulfill their civic engagement duty, which stems from like Judaism at its core almost.
So I'll give an example of in our movement, something that we've made happen in the city of Atlanta that I'm particularly proud of. So taking about 75, 80 African-American leaders from Atlanta to Israel over the course of the last decade, okay? We have a very tight, cohesive group, like we're our own tribe, all right? Shelly's current boss, who runs the Office of Public Liaison, she went on my Israel trip. With the help of the group, she matriculated to become mayor of the city. We were able to project influence through that way. Andre Dickens, who's the current mayor of Atlanta, is a very special case. He went on my trip 2016. When he came back, I was like, Andre, you're an absolutely amazing leader. We as black people feel like you should lead our city. And because of the positions you hold as it relates to Israel and how just unbelievably open and amenable you are to a strong black-Jewish relationship, we think there's common purpose between our two communities in seeing you rise to leadership. So Andre matriculates, very successful on city council, then he decides he wants to run for mayor. A previous mayor decided that he wants to run, and everybody just said it's a fait accompli, he's gonna win, okay? But folks from our space and folks from the Jewish community space who knew our group and who knew what type of leadership Andre was going to represent, we stood together, we weathered that storm. There was a gentleman from the Jewish community who stepped up in a major way. It was Andre's finance chair, rallied a tremendous amount of support for him during that election. Andre then goes on to win, and the first person who he made as a head of his transition team was a gentleman by the name of Norm Radow from Atlanta. So now think about this. You have Atlanta, which is a large city, and through a very intentional exercise that we engaged in over the course of 8 years, you now have African Americans and Jews deciding who is going to constitute the leadership of a city that we both share. And when I think about a model of how you really take this and make it as actionable on the highest level, both for the purposes of restoring faith and democracy and in coming up with solutions to make sure that the interests of both of our communities are served in the guise of bringing excellent leadership to a larger city, I think it's a model that we should look at in other cities across the country. Yeah.
So just a few quick examples of the kind of work that I'm doing now, because it flows right from the work that I did previously. One of the most impactful opportunities I had as a member of Congress was to go on the Civil Rights Pilgrimage with my late colleague, our hero, John Lewis. And it was an incredible opportunity to not just understand American history and African American history, but to really bond with everyone on our trip. Now I'm the CEO of AJC, and we're working on putting together that kind of trip for members of the Jewish community and the African American community to go back to do that civil rights pilgrimage. Second, the Muslim Jewish Advisory Council is something that we've been doing around the country, and it's never been more important than it is now. And it's actually really impactful to bring people together again on an ongoing basis, to have real conversation about things that you can work on together in Washington and I was just in Detroit and in Lansing, the issues that they're working on together there, the Muslim community and the Jewish community. That really matters, and I think that's a good one. And then I'll give you one last one just to broaden it out a bit. I know we're focused on democracy. Well, the one democracy in the Middle East is the state of Israel. And again, based on some of the work that I did in Congress, now the work that I'm doing at AJC, there are enormous opportunities to build upon what Israel has done in the region and the Abraham Accords, and to do it in a way that strengthens American democracy. Here's how. The I2U2 program between Israel, India, the United States, and the UAE has been really important in setting the stage for deeper growth and deeper relationships with those countries. Well, the Jewish American community and the Indian American community have a lot at stake in how that develops. It's a way to build our ties even more deeply with that community. And the last example, again, same idea, the opportunities in the Eastern Mediterranean that we've seen between Israel, Greece, and Cyprus, we've seen a stronger and deeper relationship grow there, again, at the government level, but also the opportunities for the Jewish community and the Greek American community, particularly here in Chicago, by the way. Shout out to all of the leaders here who have worked so closely together. Again, to work with one another, in this case Jews, and a different group that cares deeply about these same issues. All of that helps to contribute to a stronger democracy. All of that work is ongoing on a regular basis. That's how we build our more vibrant community. It has more opportunities for Jews to be involved, to be impactful, and to get to know others in our community from different backgrounds who have just as much at stake in the future of our democracy as we do.
Thank you.
And can I just add to
Yes,
that? I just wanted to
please.
give another similar example just from a few weeks ago. We had a pretty historic Sukkot celebration at the Blair House, which is across the street from the White House. This was led by Ambassador Lipstadt, and it was me, her, the second gentleman, and ambassadors from Muslim-majority countries around the table celebrating Sukkot. Can you imagine? And it was one of the most incredible experiences. There I was sitting next to the ambassador from Turkey, and he writes me a note, and he's trying to figure out how to pronounce Chag Sameach. And we're like going back and forth. He loves the Jewish community. I mean, there's been so many important relationships built just from sitting together around this round table for Sukkot. We were shaking the lulav and etrog together. We talked about the importance of religious freedom, religious tolerance, and just what we actually do. A lot of these countries, most of them don't have relationships with Israel. Most of them, not all of them have big Jewish populations in their communities, but the fact that we were all able to meet each other face to face, and I guess face to face, was really impactful. And so there are really creative ways you can go about building these bridges, whether it's around a holiday or around other holidays in other communities, and just see what happens from bringing people together.
Thank you. I know I promised more questions, but unfortunately, this conversation was so interesting and you had so many inputs. We've run out of time, and I know people have to be in like rooms 3 floors up and across the hallway, across the entire building. So I think we're going to have to end it here, but I feel like we started with concerns and toxicity and what's happening to our democracy, and is it even something that we should care about as a community? And I think we're ending on this hopeful note of just a couple of points that I'd like to summarize, which is, first of all, our young generations are already here and they're already thinking about how to live in the democracy that is today, and we're going to learn from them, and that's exciting. We don't have to do all the thinking ourselves, and that there are these examples at the grassroots where communities are working together, and internationally where communities are working together, and that is building that cohesiveness and that stability that it does become a democracy, whether here or whether it's abroad or globally. And we're not going to be Pollyannish. It's not, we can't just rely on these structures that we talked about, these wonderful examples. We have to invest in it every single day, which you do by being active civically, whether it's philanthropically, whether it's with government, but we can't let our guard down, and we have to all work together. And I think that's really the message of this panel, and thank you for joining us.
Amen.